So just make sure you ask me what the attendance code was at the end of class if you didn't get it, because we got to get it in. Okay, let's get started. Questions? Hi, hello. All right. I guess that's it. Any other questions before we start? Okay, cool. Let's get rolling. Okay, so we're introducing you to this idea of market failure. So markets are not infallible. Okay, there are problems that may occur. So remember, markets help coordinate people's actions through prices, right? We've talked about that in previous chapters. Okay, prices help coordinate people, they help signal information, right? And that in general, we assume that most of the time in a free market, consumer and producer surplus are maximized. People mutually benefit from trade in most relatively unregulated markets. But what if there's a scenario where prices don't reflect everything? Now, I see some people writing stuff down. Write down as much as you want, but this is just kind of guiding my presentation. So don't think you have to write all this down word for word. Okay, if there's a slide where you really want to write everything down, I'll let you know. Okay. But write down as much as you want. I mean, it's your personal preference on how you take notes. Okay. But generally speaking, what if prices don't reflect all the information, right? What if the market fails to deliver the best outcome? So this brings us to the idea of externalities. Okay, externalities. Now, what are externalities? Okay, well, externalities, the definition, there's a few ways you could say it. One of the ways of saying it is, it's the uncompensated impact of someone's actions on a bystander's well-being. Okay. What externalities do is they create inefficiencies in markets, and then in those markets, societal welfare is not maximized in a free market when externalities are present. So this is kind of a crucial point. The market price might not reflect. So what do we know? We know that supply curves tell us a lot about the cost of producing something. And we know that the demand curves tell us a lot about the benefit of something to buyers. Demand curves tell us what people are willing to pay. Supply curves tell us what price sellers would accept. So demand curves tell us a lot about the value to a buyer. Supply curves tell us a lot about the cost to the seller. And where those meet at equilibrium, that tells us the price that we get tells us a lot about the value of the good and how hard it is to produce and get in society. The problem with externalities is that some goods in either consumption or production might impose costs or benefits onto people that are unrelated to the exchange, people other than the buyers, people other than the sellers. So when there are externalities present, the unregulated market price might not reflect the private benefit and private cost of a good. So externalities can be either positive. So like getting a vaccine creates a positive externality, right? You go individually and get the vaccine, but people around you benefit because you're less likely to get them sick. Now that's not, the COVID vaccine is a little different, kind of, because it's an mRNA vaccine. But in the case of most vaccines, you get the flu vaccine, you're less likely to spread the flu, right? It's people around you. Externalities can be negative. I use electricity. We all use electricity. Fuel has to be burned to produce the electricity. The electricity I buy is a private exchange between myself and the electricity company, but pollution gets created. Pollution imposes costs onto everybody. So the market price of things like vaccines, things like coal, fossil fuel energy production, might not fully reflect, in an unregulated market, might not fully reflect the costs and benefits to society. So let's first talk about negative externalities. Negative externalities are probably the most commonly understood and talked about. You can probably think right off the bat, pollution is a negative externality. Trash, right? Trash buildup, plastics in the ocean, negative externalities, right? A real simple one. Let's say your neighbor hosts backyard concerts at 2 a.m. during finals week. Okay. Attendees buy tickets, which your neighbor sells. They're mutually benefiting from that trade. But what about you? You're neither a buyer nor a seller. You just live next door. And there's a spillover effect with the noise pollution from the concerts. You're not involved in the transaction. You're neither the buyer nor the seller, but a cost has been imposed onto you. You're the victim of a negative externality. So the price of that ticket might not reflect the actual costs and benefits of the concert because there are costs to you that aren't being borne by the seller. Any questions about that? Okay. So you can have positive or negative externalities, and they can occur in consumption or production. So when you consume a vaccine, it protects people you come into contact with. Okay? When you wear a mask, you are protecting people you come into contact with. There are external benefits, right? You privately buy a mask, you privately get a vaccine. That's a private exchange between you and the provider. But the social benefit exceeds the private benefit because it's not just you who's benefiting, it's the people around you. People around you who are benefiting. So we would say that there's a positive externality in consumption. Positive externality in consumption. Smoking a cigarette might cause nearby people to inhale smoke. You're imposing external costs onto people, right? There are external costs. And so the private benefit of smoking a cigarette exceeds the social benefit. To understand social benefit, you take the private benefit and add external benefit. But when there's external cost, you're subtracting. You're subtracting a cost from your own private benefit. And so the social benefit of smoking cigarettes is by definition less than the private benefit. And so there's a negative externality in consumption. I'll give you all a sec to think about that. So what about production? So this is in the production of something, there could also be externalities. If you're making honey, you keep a lot of bees on hand. Maybe you're a beekeeper, maybe you're a farmer. There's a lot of bees that you keep on hand, maybe. Well, your bees are going to pollinate nearby crops. So you're not the only one who benefits from keeping bees. The people around you. The people around you keep bees. Or the people around you benefit from your bees. Now, why are we talking about this one in terms of cost? Because it's production side. So the idea here is the bees cost me some money, but it's free for my neighbors. My neighbors don't pay for the bees. And so private costs and social costs, if we think about social costs, it's the cost to me plus the cost to others. But if I have a cost to get the bees, and then I'm giving a benefit to others, it's kind of like a negative cost for my neighbors because they're benefiting from the bees. And so we would say that the private cost of beekeeping or honey production exceeds the social cost because my neighbors get some kind of benefit, almost like the opposite of a cost. Now, this is very technical. It's, it's kind of a weird thing, right? But we speak about supply, we speak about production in terms of costs, okay? This is going to become a little clearer when we start to graph it. But there's a positive externality in production because my neighbors get to benefit from the bee pollination. Okay, producing electricity. We have to burn things. A lot of the time, we have to burn things to make electricity. Now, people need electricity. But there are costs imposed onto everyone else whenever we consume electricity, right? There are external costs. And so we would say that the social cost of something like electricity is higher than the private cost. I pay some kind of fee to the electricity company for every kilowatt hour, but that price might not reflect the cost imposed onto others through environmental damage. Okay, let's just open it up real quick. Any questions about any of this so far? What's that?
The electricity production here is like the.
So the social cost is private plus external cost. So there's a private cost, which is just the money you pay,
Yeah.
or like the cost, rather the cost to the company of producing it, plus the external cost, which is the damage to the environment. So the private cost is just the cost to the company of producing the electricity. Then there's an external cost, which is the damage to the environment. Add the two together, you get social cost. Okay, we'll keep going. Okay. What are two other goods you think might exhibit externalities? Two other goods. Think about it. What? Don't know what that is. What? Pesticide? Yeah, definitely. Pesticides create negative externalities. Exactly. Is that a spray can of Axe? Nice. Yeah, aerosol, right? And so, pesticides, I believe, would be a negative externality in consumption because it's using the pesticides that pollutes the environment, right? Not producing them itself, right? And then same thing with like Axe body spray. It's not the production of it. I mean, there could be in the production of it, but the spray itself, the aerosol, it's the use of it, right? So you got to think consumption versus production. Is the externality, does it occur when you use the thing or does it occur when you make it? So Axe body spray, the aerosol, it doesn't, the externality occurs when you use it. Don't know what this is. Chocolate in some cases. Oh yeah, so right. So in production, right? So things like cocoa beans, coffee beans. Right. So Nestle has some, unsavory practices that you can research on your own. But yeah, exactly. Coal production. So I don't know much about coal production. So I don't know much about coal mining. I know the use of coal to create energy causes a negative externality. I don't really know much about like coal mining itself, but that's what coal production would be. See if there's anything else. Fireworks. Yeah, so fireworks, created disturbance, right? I mean, they shock people, especially outside of 4th of July, right? People might think it's a gunshot or something. Noise pollution, right? Loud noises have negative externalities. So it's interesting. This looks like a nuclear power plant. I don't know. Nuclear power plants are actually pretty clean unless there's like a major mishap, which doesn't really happen in the US. But I'm definitely pro-nuclear. Yeah, car, yep. Car, I don't know what. Yeah. Yeah, driving a car, right, produces negative externalities. All right, cool. Well, I don't want to leave anybody out. All right. Okay, so the most commonly thought of is probably negative externalities from production. It's the one you can probably think of most readily, right? Pollution, okay? And what do we see? The social cost exceeds the private cost. So what does that mean? It means that it's further left, further up, right? That's a supply curve that's further to the left, further up, which represents more cost. So we have this private supply curve, and then we have the, societal supply curve, right? The private supply curve depicts the costs to the producer. The social one depicts the costs to the producer plus the external costs, right? And so what do we get? There are two possible equilibriums. There's the one in the unregulated market, and there's the ideal one that reflects the social cost. The efficient equilibrium in a market occurs where social cost equals social benefit. Demand curve represents the social benefit. Now, the demand curve also represents the private benefit. But since we're not talking about any externalities in consumption here, there's only one demand curve. If there was some kind of externality in consumption, we would have to have two separate demand curves, one representing the private benefit, one representing the social benefit. But the bottom line is that we want an equilibrium where social cost equals social benefit. And so what do we notice? When there are negative externalities, the good is overproduced. QP is greater than QS. Ideally, the price of this good should be higher and less of it should be on the market because it creates negative externalities. So if negative externalities are present, there will be too much of the good, more of the good, not that there's an excess supply, but that there's more than we want, more than society wants. More than is socially optimal. And it's the opposite. If there were positive externalities, then an unregulated market would underproduce the good. We'll talk about that in a second. So when there are negative externalities, the good is overproduced or overconsumed. There's too much of it. We want to reduce that amount because we want to reflect the costs, not just to the producer, but the costs imposed onto others. I'll make sure to post all these slides online. Okay. I'm recording. Yeah, I'll send out a recording. Yep. Okay. Let's talk about pollution as a negative externality. So this is straight from the textbook, this graph. So again, we use supply and demand just like always. Now, the way the textbook does it is they'll say S public, S private. What they mean is public, the social cost versus the private cost. So two separate supply curves. One supply curve that shows the costs to all of society, and a supply curve that just shows the costs to the producer. So let's look at the production of refrigerators. There are processes used in creating refrigerators that create negative externalities, okay? So the public supply curve is accounting not just for the cost to the producer, but the external costs as well. Now, in an unregulated market, suppliers are only accounting for their own costs. They're not considering the public supply curve or the social cost curve. You could call them either one, doesn't matter. They're only considering their own private costs, okay? But everyone bears the cost of pollution. Everyone bears the cost of pollution. And so it's not as immediate, right? That cost is not as apparent to the producer because the producer is just one company. Whereas the cost of pollution is kind of spread out over everybody. It's everybody's problem, right? So without any regulations in this market, we get an equilibrium price of $650 and 45,000 units are sold. If we were to account for the cost of pollution, we would see that the equilibrium, the ideal socially optimal equilibrium, should be a price of 700 and a quantity of 40,000. So what can we do about it? There are a few things we can do about it. I'll introduce you to one. What if we, so the idea is we want to get the company to internalize the externality. We want them to internalize the cost. So we need to figure out some way to impose the cost back on to the company. We want to try to do something that would shift this private supply curve up and to the left so it becomes the same as the public supply curve, so that the supply curve of the company would then reflect not just the cost of producing the refrigerator, but the cost of producing the refrigerator plus the cost of the pollution. So graphically, we look at the vertical distance between the two supply curves. If you compare any 2 points on the two supply curves, you'll see that they are $100 apart. If we were to impose a tax onto this company of $100 per refrigerator, their private supply curve, their private cost curve, would shift left, up, however you want to say it, to match the public supply curve, the social cost curve. And that would get us to the ideal equilibrium. So we charge them $100 fee per refrigerator, and that gets us up to the price of 700 and the ideal quantity of 40,000. It's important to understand, it's not $50, okay? It's not $50. You might think, oh, well, the equilibrium price, the difference between the equilibrium prices is $50. Let's just tax them at $50. The problem is supply has to interact with demand to get an equilibrium. And so when you impose a tax onto sellers, part of it will be passed on to buyers, but not necessarily all of it. So you can't just say, okay, what's the difference? What should the true price be? Let's tax it. Let's tax it the difference. Let's tax it the difference of $50. That doesn't work. You have to look at the vertical distance between the two supply curves. In other words, that vertical distance is the external cost. So graphically here, the external cost is literally $100. So by taxing them at exactly $100, we account for the external cost and we get to the ideal equilibrium. Questions? So how do we measure? Okay, so graphically here, how did I get the 100? I literally just look at the vertical. So it's given to us pretty much. Like it's basically shown to us graphically. The vertical distance between the two supply curves. Okay. So the vertical distance between the two supply curves is $100. So that means that we know that the external cost is $100. So graphically, if this is given to you graphically, the way it's depicted is it's that vertical distance. Okay. What's that? I mean, vertical distance, I mean, literally, so vertical means up, and so distance is any 2 points on this curve. What's the distance? 800 minus 700, 100, 750 minus 650, 100, right? How do you measure the cost of pollution? So, in the real world, that's very complex. So that is something that you would learn in like an advanced environmental economics course. So literally measuring the cost of pollution is a very complex process. And it has to do with a mix of science and sociology. We're not going to do that in this class. So you don't have to, you'll never have to, literally measure the cost of pollution. You just have to understand this graphically and how we interpret it. Wouldn't shifting the equilibrium create deadweight loss? Excellent question. Actually, there was deadweight loss from the negative externalities. So when you learned about deadweight loss previously, we were operating under the assumption that there are no costs or benefits imposed onto people other than the buyers and the sellers. So now that there are costs imposed onto people other than the buyers and the sellers, there's actually deadweight loss if we don't shift the equilibrium. Now, I'm not going to hit you with any super technical questions about this because you're just being introduced to this and then you have a quiz on Wednesday. But so for deadweight loss, you're really just going to have to know it for price controls, the basic form of deadweight loss. But technically, that red triangle, that's the deadweight loss in this market before we regulate it. Because that's the amount of cost being imposed onto society in an inefficient way. So deadweight loss here is caused by pollution in the unregulated refrigerator market. If we wanted to do the math, wouldn't be that bad. Just the area of a triangle. We know that the height is 100, looking at the prices, 750 to 650, height of 100. We know that the width is 5,000, looking at the difference in quantities. And so if we wanted to see what the deadweight loss was, it would be $250,000. So because of pollution in this market that sellers do not have to account for, it would create almost $250,000 in deadweight loss if we don't regulate this market. I'll see if there are any more questions. Attendance is 1206, 1206. All right. Do your best. This is a good exercise. You know, obviously you can't cover everything, but it's just good to take a second and stop and just try to think about what we just talked about. Write down a couple sentences, okay? Okay. Okay, good. Yep. Great. Okay, great. Yeah. So just to be clear, externalities in production. Okay. So we gotta remember here, right? Because if they're in consumption, we'll get to that in a sec. If they're in consumption, it would make two separate demand curves. Okay. And just remember, fundamentally, remember, demand curves depict benefit, supply curves depict cost. Okay. Externalities have a positive and negative side. Okay, X good. Yeah, right. That's right. Absolutely good. Yeah, that's true. So if the social benefit exceeds the private benefit, that's a positive externality in consumption. Private benefit exceeds social benefit, that's a negative externality in consumption. Great. So whenever we talk about benefit, we're talking about consumption, right? Because we're thinking about demand curves. When we talk about cost, we're thinking about production. Okay. Good. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Let's keep it rolling. All right, let's break it up a little bit, just something lighthearted. Negative externalities from trash. Oh no. Wow, doesn't that look good? Is this going to be? Wow. Do y'all remember the hysteria over the Popeyes versus Chick-fil-A thing that happened like 2 months ago? That was crazy. I don't remember.
New York City, the year 2000, the most wasteful society in the history of the galaxy. And it was running out of places to bury its never-ending output of garbage. The landfills were full. New Jersey was full. And so, under cover of darkness, the city put its garbage out to sea on the world's largest barge. Repulsive barge circled the oceans for 50 years, but no country would accept it, not even that really filthy one. Finally, in 2052, the city used its mob connections to obtain a rocket and launch the garbage into outer space. Some experts claim the ball might return to Earth someday, but the concerns were dismissed as depressing.
Wow, you got that off the internet? In my day, the internet was only used to download pornography. Actually, that's still true. Now that the garbage is in space, Doctor, perhaps you
Oh,
can
wait,
help me
shit.
with my
No.
sexual.
Okay, I didn't realize. Okay, that's a show called Futurama. You probably it's the same people that made The Simpsons. It's a show. The guy accidentally freezes himself and goes to the year 3000, and he's kind of a simpleton. Anyway, so positive externalities in consumption. Okay. So two basic, right? So we're talking about two kind of most commonly thought of examples is like, we have negative externalities in the production of energy for production of refrigerators in the textbook. It gives us pollution. Here's an example of positive externalities in consumption. So getting vaccinated creates benefits for people around you because it makes you less contagious. Again, kind of what we're saying before, since market prices reflect the interaction of individual buyers and individual sellers, they don't always reflect the true value of something to society. Oh, sorry, the image is cutting off the the G's and the L right there. Anyway, so the social benefit of you getting vaccinated is higher than the private benefit. So what we see is a second demand curve, that DS right there. So now, again, this is from the textbook, just so you know, that MPB is marginal private benefit, and that MSB is marginal social benefit. So that D sub market, D sub S, D market is like your personal demand curve for a vaccine. That DS is society's demand curve for you to get a vaccine. It's higher because not only do you benefit, but people around you benefit. And so if we didn't, we subsidize vaccines. Because if we didn't, they'd be underconsumed. So the idea here is that because there's an external benefit to you getting vaccinated, we would say that the ideal amount of vaccines is higher than the amount that private individuals would get in an unregulated market. Because you're not necessarily accounting for the benefit to others. A lot of the time, you look at the price and it's like, well, you're thinking about the benefit to yourself. Is it worth this amount of money to get this vaccine? We subsidize them to bring the price down and account for the external benefit. So whereas we might impose a tax on a negative externality, we use a subsidy on things that have positive externalities. Since in the lecture, so to be clear, there's positive and negative externalities in both consumption and production. But since my lecture today, I'm getting more specific with positive externalities of consumption and negative externalities in production, you can expect that if there's more specific questions, I'm probably going to focus on positive externalities in consumption and negative externalities in production, because those are the ones that I'm giving you the most info on, okay? But to be clear, you could have negative externalities in consumption, you can have positive externalities in production, right? It's just, I don't have time to go in depth on all four. Why is the COVID-19 vaccine free? Because there's a Pigouvian subsidy levied onto it. The government has put a lot of money toward making it easier for companies to get it. Now, this can come in various ways. It doesn't always have to be the government just giving them cash. It could be giving companies tax breaks. It could be, freeing up certain regulations to help the companies move quicker, right? Any of these things is essentially, adding value to these companies so they can reduce the price, right? And so in an unregulated market, the private benefit of you getting a vaccine is high, but not as high as it is to society, because society's benefit is your benefit. Again, you're a member of society. It's your benefit plus the external benefit to everybody else that you're vaccinated. If the COVID vaccine costs $50, you'd probably be less likely to get it. Now, again, people who have, a lot of people who aren't thinking quite like economists yet might say, well, I'd still get it. A lot of people would still get it. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people would still get it. But remember, in economics, we think about things on the margin. On the margin, we know, because of the law of demand, that if the COVID vaccine costs $50, by definition, we know fewer people would get it. That's just a fact. But the fact that it's free to buy to consumers, free to most people, means that a lot more people get it, right? So we want to try to induce basically everybody to get the COVID-19 vaccine. So we subsidize it to make it free to consumers. So they are more likely to get it. So they're more likely to get it. And so when you subsidize something, the price goes down. Right? You subsidize it, the price goes down. Just like the ideal. So maybe I haven't used the term Pigouvian yet. I apologize. Pigouvian is just what we're talking about here. A tax or a subsidy to account for an externality is Pigouvian. It's named after an economist named Alfred or Albert Pigou. I actually forget. Basically, so any kind of tax or subsidy that's meant to alleviate an externality or internalize an externality, we just use the term Pigouvian to describe it because that's the name of the economist who came up with it. And so just like the ideal Pigouvian tax on those refrigerators was $100 because the cost of the pollution was $100, the ideal Pigouvian subsidy is equal to the external benefit. So it's the vertical distance between the two demand curves in this case. The subsidies for the COVID vaccine are very large. That's why it's free. The social benefit of you getting vaccinated is substantially higher than the private benefit because we've been in, this situation for a year. Once everybody's vaccinated, we don't have to, over time, we get to stop wearing masks. We get to start having events again, right? So the benefit of a COVID vaccine to society is a lot higher even than, the regular flu vaccine. And so the more external benefit, the bigger subsidy would be used to get us to the socially optimal level. Okay. Any questions? You can also raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, keep it rolling. Okay, so let's just let's just go over some fundamentals real quick. So this is stuff I just pulled, just looking straight at top hat questions, okay? Looked at some top hat questions. If the price of a good does not account for the external costs of its production, then the market price is too low and the product will be overproduced. This is an example of a negative externality in production. Antibiotics are overused in livestock. So the production of meat, the production of chicken and pork and whatnot, particularly pork, I believe, antibiotics are overused. Now, what's the problem with that? It's creating superbacteria. There are now bacteria that are what are called colistin resistant. Colistin is the strongest antibiotic humans have. There are now bacteria that are resistant to colistin. They will kill you and you can't do anything about it. Now, it's very rare, but it popped up a couple times a couple years ago. There are bacteria now that are resistant to the best antibiotics we have because antibiotics are overused, and it gives bacteria a lot of chances to evolve and adapt to antibiotics. So whenever there are external costs or benefits present, the unregulated market price sends incorrect signals. Incorrect signals. But we can correct for this if we accurately discover the external cost or benefit and impose it back onto whoever causes the externality. We make them internalize the externality. So if you're looking at a graph, just remember that the external cost or benefit is depicted by that vertical distance between the two curves, whether it's a social cost versus private cost, also known as the public supply curve versus private supply curve, or if it's the private demand or private benefit curve versus the social demand, social benefit curve, right? You look at that vertical distance, that tells us graphically that's the cost or benefit. And so again, societal welfare is not maximized when externalities are present. Okay. We'll try to get through the types of regulation. So just bottom line, there are a few different ways. Now there are more than this, but we're not going to go over all of them. There's like one more kind of. You could either use a command and control policy to limit the production. So you can pass a law that says it's illegal to dump sludge in the river. That's a command and control policy. Now, for extreme examples like that, that's probably for the best. We probably don't want people to be able to pay to dump sludge in the river. But we can't just ban the burning of coal, right? I mean, right now the technology is there. We're like, if we did that, it would disrupt electricity all over the country, right? And so there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs, right? Burning of coal pollutes the environment, but it also creates electricity. So we have to figure out a healthy medium. So what most economists like with things like that are market-oriented solutions. Things like the Pigouvian tax or Pigouvian subsidy. It provides an incentive for people to adjust their behavior. Okay. Let's just try to get through this real quick if we can. So again, we've already talked about this. I'm not gonna hit you with anything super technical about this. Like that thing in italics is true, but it's pretty technical. The bottom line is the Pigouvian tax incentivizes a firm to find ways to reduce its pollution because you're just imposing the cost of it back onto the firm. So the firm has to actually account for it in its decisions, right? I will post these slides, okay? Marketable permits is the other one that's very common. People call this cap and trade. The idea with marketable permits is the government, maybe a city government says, here's the amount of pollution we can bear, just overall. And then they issue a bunch of permits to all the polluting companies. If you go under your pollution allotment, you can sell the excess to the other companies. And if you go over it, you have to buy excess from other companies. And so there's a cost to every unit of pollution because every time you pollute, that's less pollution you can sell to other companies. And the more you pollute, the more you have to buy pollution permission from other companies. Okay, that's it for today. So, cool. Anyway, quiz is Wednesday. I'll send out an email about review and whatnot sometime today, and I'll put the slides online. All right.
Module 9 stuff that we covered on,
Yes.
on last week or
Last week. Last week was module 9. Yep.